From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Our government has unleashed ISIS. I call President Obama and Hillary Clinton the founders of ISIS. They're the founders.
As Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump lays blame for the wars engulfing the Middle East on Obama and Clinton, we'll look at a remarkable new report on what's happened in the region since President Bush invaded Iraq in 2003. We'll speak with journalist Scott Anderson, author of Fractured Lands: How the Arab World Came Apart. His story takes up the entire print edition of this week's New York Times Magazine. But first, what was the relationship between the Clinton Foundation and the State Department under Secretary Hillary Clinton? And what would it be if she became president? We'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter James Grimaldi of The Wall Street Journal. He's covered the Clinton Foundation for years. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A series of bomb blasts in Thailand have hit 3 of the country's most popular tourist resorts, killing 4 people and wounding dozens. There have been at least 11 explosions in total since Thursday. No group has claimed responsibility. The blasts come days after Thailand voted to accept a military-backed charter in a referendum. Human Rights Watch has warned Thailand is moving toward becoming a military dictatorship. Brad Adams, the group's Asia director, said, quote, instead of the long-promised return to democratic civilian rule, the new constitution facilitates unaccountable military power and a deepening dictatorship. In campaign news, the New York Times and the Gannett newspaper chain have petitioned the New York Supreme Court to unseal records from Donald Trump's 1990 divorce proceedings with Ivana Trump. Unsealed records could determine if Ivana directly accused Trump of raping or sexually assaulting her during their 14-year marriage. According to the book Lost Tycoon, Ivana Trump used the word rape during one deposition in the divorce case. She later softened her language, saying she felt violated during an encounter where Donald Trump reportedly held back her arms and pulled out fistfuls of her hair. Donald Trump's former North Carolina campaign director has resigned after being accused of pulling a gun on at least 5 people, including campaign staffers. The director, Earl Phillip, is named in a new lawsuit filed by a staffer who claims Phillip pointed a loaded .45 caliber pistol at him and then placed the barrel of the gun on his knee while they were driving in South Carolina earlier this year. Phillip remained in his position even after the staffer notified senior Trump officials. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton traveled to Warren, Michigan to outline her economic vision just days after Donald Trump spoke in Detroit. Clinton accused Trump of paying lip service to being on the side of average Americans.
There is a myth out there that he will stick it to the rich and powerful because somehow he's really on the side of the little guy. Don't believe it.
A panel of federal judges has ordered North Carolina to redraw its legislative districts, saying the current ones are unconstitutional and racially gerrymandered. In a statement, the Reverend William Barber of North Carolina NAACP said, quote, this is a tremendous ruling that the Republican-led legislature used racial discrimination to undermine the power of the black vote and other minority voters, which is contrary to our Constitution and our democracy, unquote. Despite the ruling, the judges have allowed the current voting maps to be used in the November election. Late last month, the federal appeals court also struck down voting restrictions in North Carolina, saying they disproportionately affected African Americans. Federal Election Commission member Ann Revelle has proposed a new ban on political contributions by domestic subsidiaries of foreign corporations. Revelle said the issue is no longer a, quote, hypothetical concern, citing a recent report by The Intercept exposing how a Chinese-owned firm donated money to Jeb Bush's campaign. Such donations can now be made thanks to the Supreme Court Citizens United ruling. The Intercept's Li Fang talked about his reporting on Democracy Now!
We simply looked at some of the largest corporate donations to presidential super PACs and tried to find out their ownership structure. By chance, we found that one of the largest corporate donors to the Jeb Bush super PAC, Right to Rise, is owned by two Chinese nationals. They're permanent residents of Singapore, and they gave $1.3 million to the Jeb Bush super PAC.
The Drug Enforcement Administration has rejected requests to stop classifying marijuana as a dangerous drug with no medical use. This means marijuana will remain a Schedule I drug, the same as heroin. While 25 states have approved the medical use of marijuana, the Department of Health and Human Services maintains there's, quote, no accepted medical use in the United States, unquote. Meanwhile, in a separate decision, the government has announced it'll start allowing more universities to start growing marijuana for research purposes. Currently, it's only allowed at the University of Mississippi. In news from Los Angeles, Democracy Now! Has obtained video from the aftermath of the police killing of 14-year-old Mexican-American Jesse Romero, who died earlier this week. Police say they were responding to a call about teenagers while writing graffiti in the L.A. neighborhood of Boyle Heights. Police say they shot and killed Romero after he ran away from police and fired a gun. But witnesses contradict the police claim. The video, which begins just after the shooting, shows officers standing over the boy's body on the sidewalk, then handcuffing him. Jesse Romero was a student at Hollenbach Middle School. He would have turned 15 on August 24th. In news from Florida, more information has come to light about the police officer who fatally shot a 73-year-old retired librarian during a police training exercise earlier this week. The woman, Mary Knowlton, had volunteered to participate in a shoot-don't-shoot exercise as part of the Citizen Police Academy. She died after the officer, Lee Cole, accidentally shot her with live ammunition. Last year, Officer Cole was accused of using excessive force when he let his police dog severely maul a man who was pulled over for biking without a headlight or taillight. The incident was caught on videotape.
Get down! Get down! Get down! Get down! Get down on your face! Get down! Get down! Don't now! Get on your face! Stop resisting! Stop resisting! Lay down on your face! Lay down on your face! Do it now!
The officer, Lee Cole, has now been placed on administrative leave. In North Dakota, 14 people were arrested Thursday protesting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline that'll stretch from North Dakota to Illinois. The protest was led by members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which has been staging nonviolent protests against the pipeline for months. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe maintained the pipeline is being built in violation of the National Historic Preservation Act. Ecuador has announced it will allow Swedish prosecutors to interview WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in its London embassy, where Assange has been living for more than 4 years. Swedish authorities want to question Assange about allegations of sexual misconduct, although charges have never been filed. Assange has been confined to the Ecuadorian embassy, fearing if he were to attempt to leave, he would be arrested by British police. He ultimately fears he would be extradited to the United States, where it's believed there's a sealed indictment against him over WikiLeaks' release of documents. In Argentina, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo held their 2000th march in Buenos Aires Thursday, demanding justice for their children or grandchildren who went missing during the country's military dictatorship. The mothers have been staging regular protests in the Plaza de Mayo since 1977. Hebe de Bonafini is president of one of the groups.
Hijos queridos.
Dear children, all the 30,000 missing, 15,000 who were shot in the streets, the 8,900 political prisoners, and more than 2 million in exile who have all become our children. This is no small thing. It's the heavy burden of so many children. But it is so beautiful, so amazing, so unique. I think that there are no women like us in the world, with the strength in our bellies, in our hearts, in our bodies, with so much responsibility for our children, whom we love whom we love and whom we continue to defend.
Thursday's march in Argentina came just days after the United States declassified documents showing former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger thwarted the State Department's efforts to stop the mass killings by instead praising Argentina's military leaders in 1978. One of India's most famous movie stars has been stopped for at least the third time while entering the United States, sparking new outcry over racial profiling. Last night, Shah Rukh Khan, who is known as the King of Bollywood, tweeted to his 20 million followers a message reading, quote, "I fully understand and respect security with the way the world is, but to be detained at U.S. immigration every damn time really, really sucks." And in New Hampshire, Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte was confronted by an unusual type of protest Thursday. As she ran in a 5K road race in Manchester, a group of climate activists began running with her, wearing Donald Trump masks. They urged her to drop her support for Trump. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Newly released State Department emails are raising questions about the close ties between the Clinton Foundation and the State Department during Hillary Clinton's time as Secretary of State. The 44 emails include exchanges between top members of the Clinton Foundation and Clinton's top State Department advisors, including Huma Abedin and Cheryl Mills. CNN reports that the FBI wanted to investigate the Clinton Foundation earlier this year, but U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch pushed back. On Thursday, State Department spokesperson Elizabeth Trudeau denied any improper communication between the Clinton State Department and the Clinton Foundation.
The department's actions under Secretary Clinton were taken to advance administration policy as set by the president and in the interests of American foreign policy. The State Department is not aware of any actions that were influenced by the Clinton Foundation.
One of the newly released email exchanges is about billionaire Nigerian-Lebanese developer Gilbert Chagoury, who contributed between $1 and $5 million to the Clinton Foundation. The emails show a top Clinton Foundation executive writing to Abedin and Mills, asking for help putting Chagoury in touch with the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon. Abedin responds, "I'll talk to Jeff," referring to then U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman. On Wednesday, Gilbert Chagoury's spokesman said Chagoury, quote, was simply passing along his observations and insights about the dire political situation in Lebanon at the time, unquote. For more, we go to Santa Barbara, where we're joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Grimaldi. He's a senior writer at the Wall Street Journal and has covered the Clinton Foundation since 2014. Welcome to Democracy Now!, James. You've been covering the Clinton Foundation for years. Can you talk about what this latest group of emails suggests and how significant it is about the relationship between the Clinton Foundation under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and between the State Department under Clinton and the Clinton Foundation?
Well, I think this confirms what we sort of knew. There are obvious ties and relationships. The key tie here would be Douglas Band, who was a top aide to Bill Clinton. He helped Bill Clinton create the Clinton Foundation and sort of devised how he would spend his days in retirement. He was very close, of course, to Cheryl Mills and Huma Abedin. At one point, he was employing as a contractor Huma Abedin as Huma was working at the State Department. And during this time of the Lebanese elections, Mr. Band sent an email, as you described just now, regarding one of their greatest benefactors, Mr. Chagoury, and suggested that the State Department have the person who was the ambassador to Lebanon speak to Mr. Chagoury. It shows how donations to the Clinton Foundation win access to, State Department diplomatic officials. It's sort of begs the question, if he hadn't given that money to the Clinton Foundation, whether he would have had that kind of easy access. I would say it would probably be unlikely. It certainly would not happen as swiftly. Possibly that State Department ambassador might have consulted with this person regarding that issue, but it sure shows or seems to create an appearance of a conflict of interest, that perhaps he bought access by making those donations to the Clinton Foundation.
Well, speaking of that issue of conflict of interest, you've noted that during her confirmation hearings as Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton specifically said that she would take, quote, extraordinary steps to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. How well do you think she has followed through on that promise?
Well, over the past year, we have looked at that issue. And what I did was I went into the lobbying records to see which companies and other entities were lobbying the State Department, and also looking to see how many of them had given to the Clinton Foundation. And one of our findings was that at least 60 companies had lobbied the State Department and had given as much as $26 million. And many of those companies, 44 of those 60, had participated in what they call commitments or philanthropic projects that were valued by the Clinton Foundation at $3.2 billion. So then we went to look and see if Mrs. Clinton had done anything for these companies at the time that they were making these gifts. And we looked at several companies, UBS, Boeing, General Electric, and Microsoft and others, Walmart, who seem to have been getting favors from Mrs. Clinton, perhaps for good reason, promoting American companies and American jobs, but also coming at the same time that there were donations going to the Clinton Foundation.
And you wrote an extensive piece, James, last year about Clinton's complicated connection with UBS. Can you talk about that just as an example?
Right. That's one of our deeper dives into one of the banks that was involved, and we know that Mrs. Clinton is very close to a lot of the Wall Street banks. In this case, with UBS, they were in a bind. A whistleblower had come forward, an American who was helping UBS find Americans who wanted to dodge taxes in Switzerland, literally recruiting them to open accounts in Switzerland that would be then hidden from the Internal Revenue Service. He blew the whistle on that. The government, IRS and DOJ, wanted 50,000 accounts that they knew about in which Americans were hiding taxes, hiding their income in the UBS Swiss bank accounts so they wouldn't be taxed. In the end, UBS did not want to provide those names because there was a law in Switzerland that said they couldn't reveal that kind of confidential information. In the end, they only gave about 5,000 of those 50,000 names, and we saw the donations from UBS to the Clinton Foundation increase from a little under $60,000 to $600,000, plus they participated in a $30 million inner-city loan program, and then hired Bill Clinton to do speeches around the country for $1.5 million.
Of course, UBS was not only closely tied with the Clintons. As I recall, Robert Wolf, the head of UBS Americas, was one of the big fundraisers for President Obama. In fact, famously was playing golf with President Obama when the Justice Department announced its deferred prosecution agreement with UBS on this issue of the accounts. So there seems to have been you also raised the issue of whether other foreign policy objectives of the government were not included in the negotiated deal to eventually get Switzerland to give up at least some of those bank accounts?
Right. Well, that's how Hillary Clinton got involved. And we know this, thankfully, to WikiLeaks. The cables that were obtained under WikiLeaks happened to be that snapshot in time when these discussions were going underway. And what we saw was that when the Swiss foreign minister came to Hillary Clinton and said, we really would like to take care of this UBS problem, Hillary said, well, we have a few things we would like as well. And this was the time that the Clinton administration, the Obama administration was eager to close Guantanamo Bay. And Mrs. Clinton was pressuring Switzerland to take some of the less dangerous detainees, in particular some Chinese Uyghurs who were deemed to be not particularly dangerous, which they eventually agreed to do. That seemed to be part of the overall deal that was made between the United States and Switzerland regarding UBS.
So explain the evolution of the Clinton Foundation. I mean, not long before Hillary Clinton announced for president, didn't they rename the Clinton Foundation the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation?
Right, and she became very, very involved in the fundraising between the time that she left the State Department and when she announced her run for the presidency. She helped raise as much as $250 million from many of these same corporations in order to bulk up the endowment to keep the Clinton Foundation running in the future. In addition, she was giving a lot of speeches, as was Bill Clinton giving speeches that were being paid. As famously we know, Bernie Sanders brought up the fact that she was taking money from Wall Street and banks regarding speeches up to $250,000 a pop. We may hear a little bit more about that today or in the coming days because we understand that the Clinton campaign is getting ready to release their most latest tax returns. We already know some of this from her personal financial disclosure form, but we might see additional information coming out of her tax returns today.
And what about the public-private partnerships that Clinton established while she was Secretary of State with some major corporations and the relations of those corporations to the Clinton Foundation?
Well, exactly. There's usually never a stop in what you can do in terms of contributions you can make to the various Clinton pots. You know, you've got money that you can donate to the foundation. You can partner at the State Department. There are these partnerships between the Clinton Foundation and corporations. Some of that went into building an expo in China for the Chinese World Fair that they held there. And the Clinton Foundation, Mrs. Clinton at the State Department was very eager to see those being built because apparently under the Bush administration, it really had kind of reached a point where they hadn't raised enough money to even have a pavilion there. But then you could see that their money that coming from corporations to their own personal wallet, their purses, campaign contributions. It just seems as if there are many, many places that you can make a contribution and you can partner with either Mrs. Clinton at the State Department or get involved at the Clinton Foundation.
I want to turn to a clip of Hillary Clinton on CNN back in June. Anderson Cooper asked her about the lack of transparency of donations to the Clinton Foundation from foreign countries.
We had absolutely overwhelming disclosure. Were there, one or two instances that slipped through the cracks? Yes, but was the overwhelming amount of anything that anybody gave the foundation disclosed? Absolutely.
So there you have Hillary Clinton saying this. James Grimaldi, can you talk about what happened when President Obama tapped her to be Secretary of State? And what were the rules around what would happen with the Clinton Foundation?
Well, let me also respond to the clip. I would say the disclosure is underwhelming. Yes, they have disclosed more than they required to under the Internal Revenue Law. But when they disclose it, they don't tell you the date. They don't tell you the amount. The disclosure is very skimpy. Someone could make a donation. The only way you know is if they've increased in one category from, say, 1 to 5 million to 5 to 10 million, and then there's an asterisk that's placed next to the name of the donor that's released either quarterly or annually. It's very opaque, I think, in terms of what's disclosed. Disclosure was required by the Obama administration when she came in, but they were very vague about what those rules would be. And I think they went to the least amount of effort that they could. Also, for any fundraising that was to be done, they were supposed to consult with the ethics officers at the State Department. But so far, we've only found a handful of examples where they ever said no. And in those cases, they were really in sort of the extreme. Bill Clinton wanted to give a speech in North Korea, and I think there may have been some efforts where he wanted to raise some money in China as well. We've obtained many of those disclosure requests, and in fact, there have been some others that are still coming out through some of these emails. But like I said, it doesn't look like the State Department pushed back very often.
Didn't they change a rule around countries, that countries, the Clinton Foundation would not accept contributions from countries during that time, but then that changed?
Right. So what they did was they said, we really don't want you raising money from foreign governments because she's going to be obviously dealing with foreign governments. So they stopped doing that. And then what we realized when they did, they're very quiet. They didn't announce it. They posted on their website the 2014, I guess in 2015 for the previous year. We saw that immediately the Clintons had gone back to many of these Middle Eastern countries, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and others, Qatar, that would have raised some questions. So in other words, in this interregnum in between when she was at the State Department and when she announced her run for president, they ended up going back to the very countries that some people had raised a lot of questions about. And there are many who've raised questions about raising money from these governments and many of these sheikhs in Saudi Arabia and others in countries that have very questionable human rights and certainly don't have equal rights for women.
And to your knowledge, this issue of foreign governments donating to an American charitable philanthropy, is there any other philanthropy in the United States that has comparable donations from foreign governments as the Clinton Foundation?
Well, probably not at this scale, but I do know that there are certain government entities that make contributions, sort of like we do with USAID. I know that Switzerland has, I think, a lottery that donates. Canada. It was interesting. The Canadian State Department was making contributions coming from the same agency that was lobbying lobbying the State Department regarding the Keystone XL pipeline. Obviously, Canada wanted that pipeline to come through. It was eventually stopped. But there were donations from that same Canadian State Department that went to the Clinton Foundation around the time that that's one that slipped through in terms of a government donation around the same time that they were lobbying Hillary Clinton to accept the Keystone XL pipeline.
How does Saudi Arabia fit into this picture, James?
Saudi Arabia, with their sheikhs and others who have made donations, they're very big supporters. As is Abu Dhabi. Interesting, we had a story last year that talked about Abu Dhabi also donating around the time that their airline, their upstart airline, wanted to receive a U.S. customs facility in their airport. It was like a very real, frankly, not a very common route, and it was sort of a plum get for them to get this pre-clearance facility in Abu Dhabi for their airline.
Well, you write that Bill Clinton received $1 million for 2 appearances sponsored by the Abu Dhabi government, the United Arab Emirates, that were arranged while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State.
That's right. Those came through agencies, a tourism agency. The tourism agency obviously being run by Abu Dhabi, but one of the also big sponsors or participants in that agency was the very airline that wanted this special facility, the pre-clearance facility at their airport.
You've also written about Clinton's relationship to the Energy Pioneer Solutions. Could you talk about that company and what it was seeking?
Yeah, that's a very interesting company. Energy Pioneer Solutions was founded by Scott Klebb, who was a candidate for Congress in Nebraska. His wife Jane Klebb, happens to be one of the big opponents of the Keystone XL pipeline, so very well known in Nebraska. But interesting, this company, which weatherized homes and put in insulation, had as its co-owners the treasurer of the Democratic National Committee, Mark Weiner, a Rhode Island official very close to Bill and Hillary Clinton, going back to the 70s and to their 92 campaign. He recently passed away during the Democratic National Convention, and Bill Clinton mentioned him in his speech at the convention. and Bill and Hillary both went to his funeral. He was a co-owner, as was a woman who lives about 3 miles from Bill and Hillary's house in Chappaqua, New York. This company received a $2 million commitment that was arranged by the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative, and Bill Clinton called the Energy Secretary, Stephen Chu, in order to get them an $840,000 grant. That's raised some questions about whether the Clinton Foundation is being used to sort of feather the nests of many of their friends.
This is a for-profit company.
It is a for-profit company, very unusual for a for-profit company to get a federal grant from the Department of Energy. The company isn't doing too well, as I understand it. They're reconfiguring their business plan, and it has not worked out, I think, as they had expected. But I think it may still be incorporated in Nebraska.
Finally, a big issue that's been raised is the relationship of the close advisors to Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, Cheryl Mills in particular, who goes back to being Bill Clinton's attorney defending him during the impeachment hearings in Congress. Then now the right-hand person of Hillary Clinton. And one of the issues raised in this email in the emails is that she went to New York on her own dime, they're now saying, took a train up to help choose the new head of the Clinton Foundation during her tenure as, top State Department official. Any issues here with that, James?
Well, she's at the center of everything involving Hillary Clinton at the State Department. She's basically Hillary's consigliere at the State Department, and she is the keeper of all the Clinton secrets. And she also would be the enforcer at times when Bill Clinton might have been pushing too hard for some of these questionable donations. But there's no question she was sort of in the middle of every major decision that's ever been made by the Clintons, a very, very close advisor to Bill and Hillary Clinton, and very close to Hillary, and in fact had an official position in the State Department.
Finally, could the Clinton Foundation exist as it is now if Hillary Clinton is president?
Well, Bill Clinton was asked that question. He hasn't really answered it. He said he doesn't want to count his chickens before they're hatched. But I think all of the people around Bill Clinton, including people in the Clinton campaign, say there's really no way it could continue to operate. And I think that Bill is pushing back on that from what we understand, that he wants to continue to do some of the good work that they do, for example, helping to negotiate AIDS drugs in Africa at better prices. The Clinton Health Initiative, I think, really wants to continue to raise money. Many of these foreign donations are actually going to the Clinton Health Initiative, Health Access Initiative, as it's known, or CHI. And so I think there's a tension between the Clinton campaign for president and the Clinton Foundation about what exactly will happen. Those negotiations are well undercover. They're not transparent. We don't know what they are. We don't know what will happen. And I don't foreclose the possibility that the Clinton Foundation will continue to operate and that they will raise money from some of the same places. And I think that really these questions need to be asked of the Clinton campaign. If she plans to continue, whether Bill plans to continue to run the Clinton Foundation as it is, what form it will take, what it will look like, and how it will raise money.
James Grimaldi, thanks for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, senior writer at the Wall Street Journal, has covered the Clinton Foundation for a number of years. This is Democracy Now! We'll link to his articles at democracynow.org. We'll be back looking at Trump's latest comments that President Obama and Hillary Clinton are the founders of ISIS, but we'll go way beyond that. A remarkable full issue of the New York Times Magazine is coming out this weekend with one author, and we're going to be speaking with him, Scott Anderson, looking at the wars of the Middle East since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Stay with us.
I'm an A dealer. You index to your trade freezer. A dealer. Get a fix to your GDP. Call it charity. Believe it's free. I control inflation and own nations with donations. Got presidents signing checks and a fleet of IMF private jets. Reconstruction packs. Get your hook quicker than crack. Permanently. Have your grandchildren working for me. Exports and all collateral. Trade overseas and injections of capital. I start with a contract and a signature. Every day get a call to deliver more. From a primitive village to the biggest shores. Even poor coming back from a little more. A dealer. Leave you with large debts and a contained fever. I'm an aid dealer. Injecting charity till your veins Caesar. Botswana, Ghana, Nicaragua, Angola, Somalia, Ethiopia, Yugoslavia, Slovakia, Liberia, Nigeria, Indonesia, Colombia, Bolivia, Panama, Burkina Faso, Brazil.
A dealer by Colcutt here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the wars engulfing the Middle East, a topic which has resurfaced as part of the 2016 presidential campaign. Speaking at a campaign event on Thursday, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump said Barack Obama and Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton created the Islamic State.
Our government isn't giving us good protection. Our government has unleashed ISIS. I call President Obama and Hillary Clinton the founders of ISIS. They're the founders. In fact, I think we'll give Hillary Clinton the, if you're on a sports team, most valuable player, MVP. You get the MVP award. ISIS will hand her the most valuable player award. Her only competition is Barack Obama between the two of them.
Well, on Thursday, conservative radio talk show host Hugh Hewitt asked Trump to clarify his comments.
I got two more questions. Last night, you said the president was the founder of ISIS. I know what you meant. You meant that he created the vacuum. He lost the peace.
No, I meant he's the founder of ISIS. I do. He's the most valuable player. I give him the most valuable player award. I give her, too, by the way.
But he's not sympathetic to them. He hates them. He's trying to kill them.
He was the founder.
Well, there you have Donald Trump answering Hugh Hewitt's questions. All of this comes as a report by the Syrian Center for Policy Research finds the death toll in Syria has reached nearly 500,000 people. In April, President Obama announced the deployment of 250 more special ops troops to Syria in a move that nearly doubles the official U.S. presence in Syria. Syria is only one of a number of ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Last year, a record 60 million people around the world were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees. Well, reporter Scott Anderson examines all of this and much more in a remarkable new report published in this week's New York Times Magazine. It's called Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart, examining what's happened in the region in the 13 years since the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003. It's told through the eyes of 6 people in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iraqi Kurdistan. The report also includes photographs by Paolo Pellegrin, a virtual reality video that allows the viewer to embed with Iraqi fighting forces during the battle to retake Fallujah. Scott Anderson is also the author of the book Lawrence in Arabia, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Scott.
Thank you.
An entire issue of the New York Times Magazine. First, respond to what Donald Trump is saying. And again, for his surrogates who are going around saying this is a metaphor, he's just as Hugh Hewitt says, what you really mean is that they created a vacuum for ISIS. He made it very clear. Right. He said, no, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are the founders of ISIS.
Right. This is kind of an extrapolation of a Republican talking point that's been out there for the last couple of years, which is that by withdrawing American troops from Iraq in 2011, the Obama administration created the vacuum that allowed ISIS to step in. What's very conveniently forgotten in that whole issue is that it was the Bush administration that negotiated the withdrawal of American troops. In the spring and the summer of 2008, they negotiated with the Maliki regime to have American troops extend on, to have a pretty substantial American military presence in Iraq going forward. And what that foundered on was that the Maliki administration would not give American service members immunity from any crimes they might commit in the country. And on that basis, the Bush administration, not the Obama administration, announced they were pulling all troops out of Iraq by 2011. So I think this Trump idea is a carry-on from this talking point that's been kind of floating out there for the past couple of years.
In fact, Donald Trump, in 2007, in an interview with Wolf Blitzer on CNN, when Blitzer said, "What do you want to happen?" because by then he had come out against the war in Iraq. Right. In 2007, he said the U.S. should just get out now.
Well, of course he did, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all. He seems to have been taking, both sides of every issue for a number of years, so.
Well, I wanted to get to your epic piece here, because I think the important to me is in this country where we suffer so much from historical amnesia. You attempted in a newspaper magazine piece to go into the history before the United States even began to get involved in the Middle East, to lay the basis for some of the problems, especially in the most failed states now, back to European and colonialism in the region after World War I.
That's right. If you look at there's 22 nations in the Arab world, and if you look at the three that have really been sort of torn apart, fragmented by the so-called Arab Spring, it's Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and it's not coincidence that those are also three of the very small group of countries that were kind of created from whole cloth by the Western colonial powers at the end of World War I. And in each of those countries, what you have is a very weak sense of national identity.
And this is from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire?
From the Ottoman Empire. They're all part of the Ottoman Empire. And so there's this very fragile sense of national identity. And in all three of those cases, you had these very brutal totalitarian dictators come in. And among the other things they did, they were trying to forge this sense of national identity. And when in the Arab Spring, when Saddam Hussein, when Muammar Gaddafi are overthrown, Bashar al-Assad is on very teetering. What people's primary loyalty goes to is not to the state often, but to their tribe, to their clan, to their sectarian affiliation.
Explain, though, for people who don't understand how countries get created,
right,
especially younger people now.
Right.
What you lay out so well in this piece, how these countries were carved up.
Right. Under the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans, it was a rather ingenious empire, because the very weakness of the Ottomans was they turned into their strength, which was it was a very decentralized, very weak central authority empire. They gave their different provinces and different regions tremendous autonomy. As long as you paid your taxes and met your military conscription rates, you were kind of free to run yourself, as you saw fit. Very little authority came down from Constantinople. When the Ottomans joined Germany in World War I, they lost. They're on the losing side, and the winners from World War I, especially Great Britain and France, they saw the Ottoman Empire as, they called it the Great Loot. That this was the spoils of war that they could divide up. So they came into the Middle East and they formed these artificial states. Iraq is essentially a joining together of three autonomous Ottoman provinces, a Shia component, a Sunni component, and a Kurdish component in the north. Syria it's kind of just the opposite. Greater Syria encompasses an enormous area that today would be Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan. So with this kind of greater Syria region, they divided it up into sort of more manageable parcels. In the case of Libya, you had three provinces under the Ottomans that were very distinct. In that case, it was the Italians who came in and joined them together and created this colony of Libya.
So then in the Arab Spring, you have convulsions across the Middle East, but you note that those nations that had more historical development, like Egypt, managed to somehow survive intact without this kind of civil war, but the ones that were created artificially out of the European colonialism are the ones that have suffered the most.
That's right. I mean, it really is. There's a commonality to the countries that have really fractured apart. Egypt's a sad case in its own right. For different reasons. But I don't think there's ever been a realistic fear in Egypt that it's going to somehow fracture apart. Because there is certainly in Egypt, there's a sense of nationalist identity going back 1,000, 2,000 years.
So you have these 6 figures who you use to sort of illustrate, take us through the crises in these countries. And in Egypt, talk about the young women that you profile.
In Egypt, Layla Swaif, she's the matriarch of this political dissident family. That she has been active in resistance against the dictatorship going back to the 1970s. She was active against Anwar Sadat, then under Hosni Mubarak. She and her husband, who's now deceased. She was, when the Tahrir Square demonstration started in January of 2011, she was in the forefront of it. She has 3 children who all became activists.
We've talked to frequently her son having been in prison, and her daughters.
Right. And now two of the 3 children are in prison for extended periods. The interesting thing about Layla Swaif is that very early on, even before Mubarak was overthrown, and it was about a 12-day revolution, she saw the danger signs of the revolution being subverted. She was lobbying for the kind of political leadership, the anti-Mubarak political leadership in the country, to essentially seize power. She was basically telling them, do not let the military kind of step into this, and she was not listened to. And really, what's happened in Egypt over the last 4 or 5 years is very much a disaster foretold.
We have to break, and then we're going to come back to this discussion. We're talking to Scott Anderson, who's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. This week, he contributed quite a lot. His article is the entire issue without any advertisements of the magazine. It's called Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Music by Niaz here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're talking with Scott Anderson. The New York Times did something very unusual this weekend coming up. The entire issue of the New York Times Magazine is devoted to one article, well, which is divided into a number of parts. It's called Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart. Scott Anderson's most recent book is called Lawrence in Arabia, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Juan?
Well, I wanted to ask you, one of the people you profiled, Waqas Hassan, who, a former ISIS fighter in Iraq. You also interviewed about 20 other former ISIS fighters. What did you learn from those interviews and from his story?
There is an amazing pattern. As you say, I interviewed probably just around 20 ISIS fighters, all imprisoned either in Iraq or in Kurdistan now. The one pattern I found over and over again was that they're all young men, kind of with very bleak futures, either unemployed or underemployed from working class families. Not religious at all. None of these, according to them, They were not from religious families. They did not know the Quran very well. In a couple of cases, I knew the Quran better than they did. They were not recruited in mosques. They joined because their buddies joined. I mean, because they saw stuff on social media. They've all, everybody has mobile phones in that part of the world, and they'd all seen the ISIS videos. And I think it was this kind of decision that young men make, that better to live large for a couple of years and the power and the so-called glamour but the power that comes of carrying a gun, and then worry about what happens in the future, 2 or 3 years down the road. So I felt it was certainly in my experience of these kind of foot soldiers, the grunts who are primarily the ISIS members I've talked with. They had more akin to why somebody might join like an inner city gang, or why in Mexico they might join a narco gang. It's this kind of despair at seeing any sort of future, but it's not political, it's not religious. It's just this impulse to have some sort of, it's awful to say in terms of ISIS, but adventure.
But that's a quite different perspective from what we get here.
Yes.
These are religious zealots who are willing to die for Islam.
That's right. No, it's very different. And like a lot of cults, what you mentioned the character and the subject of the article, Waqas Hassan, he joined up. He was brought in by his older brother. Waqas at that time was 19. His brother was 26. Part of his basic training was to execute 6 different prisoners of ISIS on 6 different occasions. So it was this kind of brutalizing process where they brought him out of the barracks, and he was told he had to shoot somebody in the back of the head on 6 different times. And he was, at this point, he's in. It's like being in a cult, and now you're there. And at least in his view, there was no way to get out once he had signed up.
You have an amazing part of the end of part 1 of your article. It's in October 2002. This was right around the time the U.S. Congress voted to authorize war. Hillary Clinton voted to authorize the invasion of Iraq. You interviewed Muammar Gaddafi, and you asked him who would benefit if the Iraq invasion actually occurred. You write, "The Libyan dictator had a habit of theatrically pondering before answering my questions, but his reply to that one was instantaneous. Bin Laden, he said. There's no doubt about that. And Iraq could end up becoming the staging ground for al-Qaeda, because if the Saddam government collapses, it will be anarchy in Iraq. If that happens, actions against Americans will be considered jihad." Yeah. These are the words of the Libyan leader who ruled for, what, like 42 years.
Yeah.
You interviewed him.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, and he was absolutely prescient of what was going to happen in Iraq. I had been trying to get an interview with Muammar Gaddafi for almost 3 years, and I finally got it. I'm convinced, because by the autumn of 2002. The drumbeat for war in Iraq was really building. I mean, it seemed pretty clear that the anti-war demonstrations were not going to have an effect. We were going in. And Gaddafi was worried that he was going to be next, that after the Bush administration overthrew Saddam Hussein, that they were going to come after him. And the Bush administration had already been floating that out. They had a hit list. And Gaddafi was on there, then Assad was somewhere down the list, because he, in Syria, they weren't the full-fledged axis of evil, but they were rising up. So so I went and spent 3 weeks in Libya and interviewed Gaddafi, and he was absolutely right. Everything he predicted came true to the T.
Did he talk about what would happen to him?
No. And the very interesting thing is, one of the most memorable things in the interview is it was almost my last question to him. It's kind of a platitudinous question. I said, "How would you like to be remembered?" And he was so comfortable in the interview and so kind of arrogant about his position in Libya. He started off giving this kind of very, very platitudinous answer. It's like, well, I would hope to be remembered as selfless, that I gave to my people, that, just these kind of throwaway answers. And then he kind of paused for a second, and he chuckled, and he leaned towards me, and he said, "And I hope this is actually really true." In other words, maybe it's always just been all about me. Anyway, So no, he had no. I don't think he had any clue that what was coming. Nor did I think it over and over again. And I don't think Hosni Mubarak, right up until the day he had to resign, he ever thought he was going to go. I think it's part of the nature of these kind of personality cults these dictators build around themselves, that they're so inoculated that they've just really lost touch with reality.
I wanted to ask you the bigger question that you try to tackle here. What went wrong with the Arab Spring? Because we're in a situation right now where both in Europe and in the United States, people are faced with this enormous, one, refugee problem out of the Middle East, and two, these failed states, including Yemen, which we haven't talked about at all. Yep. And yet there's no connection made between growing intervention from Europe and the United States is leading to more destabilization rather than less, and how you get out of that situation.
Yeah, it's very hard. If there's any consolation in the current situation, I think we're kind of near the bottom of how bad it can get. It's hard to see how places get much worse. Although Libya is going to get worse next year, because along with the kind of division between different militias, you're also headed for an economic crash that's coming in Libya next year. They're going to run. They're just running out of money. It's hard to see how Syria gets worse. It's hard to see really how Iraq gets worse. But I think that. So it's very hard to see what an intervention actually looks like. I've often thought, well, what is the Obama administration's foreign policy in the region? And I don't think it really has one. I think it's utterly reactive at this point. But then it's hard to imagine what a proactive policy in the region would actually look like. I mean, what do you do in a place like Syria? I mean, at least in Iraq, there now seems to be kind of an operating coalition against ISIS, but I think the problem, and I personally feel that militarily ISIS is going to be pretty much destroyed in the near future. But ISIS is not just a military. It's not a guerrilla group anymore. It's an idea. And as I was talking about, these young men, you have millions and millions of young men throughout the Middle East with no economic futures, who are not necessarily religious or even political in any way. But also, what you have throughout the region is a kind of a built-in resentment against the West. So that whole breeding ground is just going to continue on, and I don't see how you deactivate that.
Well, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Any word to the wise on how to read this entire issue, which also has a virtual reality tour of the retaking of Fallujah with Iraqi soldiers?
Right. I don't know. It's hard for me to say how to because it's been my baby for a year and a half now. I don't know how to suggest how to treat it. I think like it's the story of 6 stories are kind of interwoven, and I think to find the stories that I think different stories will resonate with different people, and to stay with that.
Well, I want to thank you, Scott Anderson, who has written this remarkable total issue of the New York Times Magazine called Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart. In print, it occupies the whole issue. That does it for our broadcast. Very special congratulations to Dave Enders and his wife, Monica, their new baby, Sophie Grace. Welcome to the world. Democracy Now! Has some job openings, including senior news video producer. Go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Gina Guzder, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Ndura, and Andre Lewis, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our website is democracynow.org. Thanks so much.